All right, so I want to thank you guys all for coming. First and foremost, just by show of hands, how many people in this room have a Facebook account and use it on a period of at least once every 2 weeks? And how about the same rule goes for Twitter? Who uses a Twitter account at least every 2 weeks? Okay, so at least a majority of us have a Facebook or Twitter. Just wanted to establish that to start off with. Now, when we think through what social media is as a context, it's hard for us to grasp what social media actually stands for. And for the purposes of this presentation and the paper that goes along with it, the definition that we're going to use for social media is a form of electronic communication through which users create online communities to share information, ideas, personal messages, and or other various forms of content. So when we think this through, the leading ones that come to mind for us are Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, Google+, MySpace, Tumblr, some people still use a Zanga, those types of things. And to give you a context, there are so many social medias out there, and for us it's easy to think that this list that we see here is an all-encompassing list of social media. But in reality, if you were to explore the entirety of the internet and find every social media platform that has more than 100,000 users, you would find in excess of 2,000 forms of social media worldwide. So to give you an idea of what that would look like, you're going to see on the screen now 80 leading forms of social media. And you can see a lot of these we recognize, so we know Facebook, LinkedIn, Google+, Twitter, Instagram, but then there start to become some that are less known, more obscure. Some that come from the homeland of Jay and Korea, some that come from Cambodia, from China, some from South America. And as we go through this, there are some that we consider dead at this point, Zanga, MySpace, some that are emerging, such as Foursquare, and some that are prominent in the culture and in the social market share of Facebook. So as you look through this, can you guys recognize at least 10 or so that come to mind that you've used or you can establish as something you've heard of? So like I said, this is 80 different forms of social media. Even all the way down, the last thing that showed up on the bottom, library thing, there's an entire social media culture surrounding what books you own in your home. Social media in and of itself does not just encompass Facebook, does not just encompass Twitter. This is another way that we can look at social media in the social media breakdown. Originally, when social media came into play, you had such things as Facebook and Twitter as like the things that we think of with social media. But what we don't often realize is that in order to use Facebook, in order to use Twitter, there are entire social media platforms that come in response to those. So in the upper right-hand corner, that's almost 8 apps right there that you can get on a phone, or 8 different programs you can use just to manage your social media platform of Twitter. So our culture now with social media has transferred from a culture where we use Twitter to where we use things to manage Twitter, such as TweetDeck. We've developed entire programs. On this sheet, you see a majority of these 102 different forms of social media, 91 of them, or excuse me, 91 of them are actually things that we use to manage our forms of social media. Not just the social media form in itself, Twitter and Facebook on the far right side, but things such as games, such as tweet management profiles. These are responses that our culture has developed to the fact that we have a struggle with keeping up with the progressive development of social media. So in order to understand what social media looks like for us as a whole, it's important for us to step back and realize some of the facts and statistics, some of the background of social media, and also of the internet use. In 2004, in February, of all the people in the entirety of mankind on the planet Earth, 745 million people out of the 2,937,000 people used it on a daily basis. Daily use, okay? So when we look at what that means, on a daily basis in 2004, 745 million people were on the internet. Since then, it has increased to 2.9 billion. To give you an idea of what that looks like, we're saying that it has gone from approximately 11% of the world's population of 6+ billion to now 40.5% of people in the world on a daily basis are on the internet. And they base that on looking at a person using it no less than half an hour. So this discludes grandma who gets on to check email and gets off. It discludes the 3rd grader who gets on to check email and gets off. This is only people who use it for at least half an hour. All right? Now thinking through how that affects social media, in September of 2013, Mark Zuckerberg went public saying that there were now 1.19 billion social media accounts on Facebook, meaning that there were 1.19 billion users on Facebook. And while he openly admits that only about 75 to 80% of them are daily active users, that number still encompasses 41% of all people who daily use the internet. So to give you an idea of what that means, the market share of Facebook for users of the internet is 41% of people. I think that if Kuiper could have 41% of all Christians in West Michigan come to its school, our population would be bigger. So in any business, if you have 41% market share, that's an amazing thing to have. To give you a view of what this looks like, this graph actually starts, it's hard to see just the coloring, but it actually starts down here. But the number of people on Facebook remained so small until you reach the point of February 2008, or 2006, that you can't actually see it rise. But once we get to the era of about February of 2009, the usage of Facebook became so prominent, we started having it show up in cultural icons such as TV shows and movies, having it referenced on sitcoms, having it referenced in soap operas, having it referenced by comedians and their stand-up comedy acts. And because of that, there was this progressive growth that's continuing to go up. In fact, so far, in the 6 minutes since I started my presentation, there have been approximately 107 Facebook accounts created worldwide. By the time that I finish my presentation, that number will have grown to over 500 Facebook accounts created worldwide, just to give you a perspective of how fast that grows. And Facebook openly admits that of those over 500, the attrition rate will drop so that after 6 months, 300 of them will be daily users. So when we think of language and we think of how language affects us as individuals, the first thing that we have to think about is dialect. West Michigan has a dialect. You go to different parts of America, you have a different dialect. You go to Ireland and we think of Luke Carrick and his dialect. We think of England and they have a dialect. There's different ways in which we structure our language. And for the purpose of this presentation, our definition of dialect is going to be a regional variety of language distinguished by features of vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation that separate it from other regional varieties and constituting together with them a single language. Now, how does that apply to social media? We step back and we think social media, from our perspective as a Kuiper College student, we still speak English, we still use the same grammar that we've used, we still use the same words, but that was the case when it started, and now it's no longer the case. So social media in and of itself has its own unique forms of dialect, such as acronyms or shortened words. And I know that this might come as a surprise to you, but totes fave and LOL are not actually in the English dictionary. Okay? There are words that we hear, sorry Caitlin, there are words that we hear when we walk through Kuiper's hallways that are used on a daily basis by people. In fact, sitting in the lunchroom the other day when someone got up to go get dessert, they literally said BRB and went to get dessert. BRB is not in the English dictionary. However, the impact of this is being shown in the English dictionary. If you look at a report that comes out every year from Oxford, they publicly release words that are being added to the dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary, and publicly release words that are being taken out of the English dictionary. There are words that every year develop a way into the English dictionary. Furthermore, these words, if you went back 25 years ago and you found your grandma, so you get in your time machine, and you go back and you find grandma and she's cooking a meal for your mom or dad, and you say LOL to her, grandma's gonna probably not even know what that means. And if she is gonna know what it means, it's not gonna mean nothing out loud to her. The same if you say TTYL or BBL or BRB. These are things that to us make so much sense, but to other people make no sense. And part of why that is because we have a culture surrounding social media. You go on Twitter, you can only use 140 characters to write a message. So words start dropping the G on the end of them. They start shortening to one syllable instead of three. You start making acronyms, and this is a form of dialect. Now, social media has other aspects to it that are very unique and separate them from what we're seeing in this communication I'm having with you or what you would see talking face-to-face with a professor. Such aspects as nonverbal signal restrictive communication. And what that means is, when I look at you, I can see certain people who look like they're falling asleep, certain people who are really attentive and looking at me, certain people whose eyes are clearly on their cell phone. That's a form of nonverbal communication. I don't need you to tell me, Doug, I'm bored. I can tell when I see this. I don't need you to tell me, wow, this is really interesting, because I can tell when I see you looking at me. These are nonverbal forms of communication. The second thing that we lose when we view social media is tonal restrictive communication. We lose the ability for me to hear my wife say to me, I'm mad at you, as opposed to, I'm mad at you. When you lose that ability to distinguish the tone in someone's message, oftentimes if you don't know the person very well, or even if you do, you interpret what you think they're trying to say to you based on the words. Just by show of hands, in the last week, how many of us have actually read a tweet, a Facebook, an email message, and you interpret it one way, but in reality it probably went the other way? Okay, so a number of us. And that's because we don't often read them, much like you might read, for instance, a playwright script where there's a whole paragraph in parentheses about how a person's feeling, and then 4 words. We don't type messages like that anymore. And the other things that we see are mood and attitude communications done via text. So what this often looks like is you can now go on Facebook and you can type up a whole entire status and then click, I'm feeling excited, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling happy. We now simply put in 3 or 4 words to tell people the emotion that we have, which while it does allow people to have a chance to understand we think we feel this way, there is a large amount of that that's restricted in and of itself, because when I think that I'm feeling happy, the interpretation other people might have if they're actually in front of me is very different. And then the final thing is obviously the restricted face-to-face contact. Social media has gotten to the point where now, globally, people are able to live their entire lives without having to actually interact with people. In fact, in a 2012 survey done of 35,000 Americans, the conclusion was that of 35,000 Americans working full-time jobs, 26% of them openly admitted more quality communication happened online in non-face-to-face ways than what happened in face-to-face ways. Meaning people who get up and go to a full-time job day after day believe that a majority of their quality communication that they had happened without seeing a person at all, but simply typing to them. So our culture in and of itself is shifting from the way in which we do communication. Albert Morabian wrote a book called Silent Messages. It's relatively old. Some of you may have read it in a communications class. Many of you probably haven't. We have it in the library. Go pick it up. It's great. But he determined that this is how you separate communication. He said that 7% of communication, only 7%, is the words in which we speak, or in the social media form, the words we type. But the rest, the other 93%, is split between the vocal tone that we use to communicate and the nonverbal signals in which we use to communicate. So when I was referring to someone on their phone or someone looking like they're falling asleep in class, professors, if they were to just simply be speaking from behind a wall through an opening and not see you, wouldn't realize that they're boring you until they can actually see you and see that you're falling asleep in class. So that 7%, it restricts the ability for us to have an understanding of what the other person's thinking, seeing, and feeling. So now, for the majority of the work that was done in the paper that this presentation is on, I conducted a survey in which I sent out to various colleges and universities, to one individual at those universities that I knew. I sent them a survey and asked them, find members of your faculty or staff who have been on staff for 5 years and have at least a bachelor's degree and are working towards a master's degree. And ask those individuals to fill out a survey in an unbiased form without putting down their name, their department, or the number of years that they've worked. Just simply fill out the survey and give comments to the questions. And the focal point of the survey was to ask questions about whether or not they felt that there was a decline in quality of communication with their students and why they thought that was. And so the first several questions of that survey were to determine, are these professors individuals who are the social media culture individuals, or are they of the non-social media culture? And it was interesting to find that out of 125 surveys that were received back, 94 professors, and these come from schools such as Kelvin and Aquinas and Hope and Central Michigan and Western Michigan and Michigan State and University of Michigan, 94 of the 125 professors openly admitted that they use Facebook on a daily basis, and 58 of those 94 said that they openly admit to regularly communicating with students. And the regularly communicating was defined as once a week communication with students. As we look at Twitter, 71 out of 125 use Twitter, and 36 of those communicate with students. Now, the really interesting part about this was that communication with students. The question that was phrased to them was, of your communication with students, looking at percentages, do you communicate more often on a personal level or more often as an instructor-student academic level? 46 of the 60 people who indicate that they communicate with their students said that they do it for personal reasons. Now, not assuming that that's an inappropriate thing, when asked to comment on that, many of them said, it's great to know what my students are out doing at night. It's great to know that my students have a social life. I found out my students married. So for professors, it allows them to better understand their students because they can look at their students' pictures and their profiles and get more of an idea of them. Some professors had great insight into their students. One in particular said, I was reading the profile of my student and realized he's dyslexic. Now I can change how I teach him. So some students can use it for a very introspective way as to how they can teach better, but a vast majority of professors openly admit that they use this to personally communicate with their students. So when looking at this concept and asking professors about the idea of a communication shift, the question was, do you believe that in the past 5 years that the quality of communication you've had with students, the grammar structure, the way in which they respect you or don't respect you, the way in which they address you, do you think these things have shifted? And if so, how? 108 out of 125 professors openly agree that they feel that there's been a communication shift, and that it's been for the communication to go from one level downward to another level. And in looking at this, things from my students no longer address me as professor, but by name, without my permission. Or my students no longer address me as Professor so-and-so in an email, but more just saying, hey, ... And while as students, sometimes this seems normal to us, because when I communicate with Jeremy, I don't even put a salutation, I just start typing. Or while I communicate with Jay, I often just say, hey, what's up, and then write something. There's something to be said in the academic world for an individual who's already put in their time, who's gotten their bachelor's degree, gotten their master's degree, and is now in a position of authority over us. And so for us, as students, there's that level of respect that has to be found with our professors. Now, this also changes in the communication realm, not just from how we structure our communication professionally, but also the ways in which our communication exists. And looking towards FaceTime and emails. Now, FaceTime is not a social media app. FaceTime literally refers to how much time does your professor have with you face-to-face. And so having a conversation about this, professors openly admit, 80 of the professors said that they see their students less often than they normally would have 5 years ago. And in looking at this, there was actually the question of how much less do you see them and why. And many of the professors openly admit that outside of the class period, they see their students roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours less per week. And such things as my students no longer come to my office, to my students no longer talk to me in the hallway, to my students don't come to open hours, to my students don't eat lunch with us, to it's hard to schedule things with students. These were all issues that professors came up with. And I know for us here at Kuiper, where I can walk into the cafeteria and many of the faculty staff members I see here will be sitting in the cafeteria eating lunch with us, for us it's a little bit different. But when we step back and think of it large scale on a university where there's 5,000, 10,000, or 40,000 students, communication fluctuations change rapidly. In fact, of these professors, 101 of them openly admitted that their communication more predominantly occurs in email format. And when asking the professors to define that for me, I found that 90 out of 125 professors indicated that they email students 10 emails more per week than they did 5 years ago. One professor in particular said that he's now to the point where he conducts his class periods 1 hour out of the 3 that he's supposed to, but the Wednesday and Friday classes, students don't even come to class, they work independently and email him questions. So the communication with the students has entirely changed, where rather than sitting in a class for three hours a week, he sits in the class for only 1 hour and instead has his students email him on a regular basis. So where is this connection going to be found? 108, as we already said, 108 out of 25 professors saw that there was a decline. And when asked why they thought this was, leaving the question open-ended to professors, just asking, why do you think this is? And the second question, do you believe that there's a correlation? 80 out of the 125 professors felt that there was a defined correlation. When trying to figure this out, it was very difficult for me, because my fear was if I just simply give them a question, do you think that this is because people use social media? That most people would probably say, oh, of course, that's got to be the only explanation. But when we structured the question in such a way, first asking them, why do you think there's a correlation? And second, asking them, is this in any way related to Facebook? The next couple of slides are going to show you some of the responses that we received. So in particular, one professor said students using and I took a direct quote, so it might be hard to put this in the structure, but asking him to give an example, he said students using dialect in papers that is similar to that which is found in social media networks. He went on to explain that he's a pre-law professor, and he teaches level 300 and 400 classes, and he had a pre-law student at the University of Michigan turn in a thesis-based paper at the end of her last semester, in which one page had 14 different ing verbs with no G at the end of them. The same paper had LOL written into it, and the same paper had 19 words abbreviated down to one syllable that were at least 2 or 3 syllables long. And we have to realize that this is a to-be lawyer, someone who soon will be taking a bar exam. And so he went on to explain, and he was very gracious in giving a whole page-long explanation, that his fear is that students are now using in papers, in academic papers, things that are found more in their culture, things that are found in communication with their classmates, in communication with their out-of-school friends, in communication with their parents and their childhood friends. Another quote from a different professor was, students no longer understand nonverbal communication without having to actively force themselves to think it through, as opposed to subconsciously understanding it as they ought to at this stage of development. And so going back to what I had said earlier about social media, it's easy for me to look out of the room of people who I'm presenting to and see the people who are paying close attention, the people who are Snapchatting, the people who are falling asleep. But his argument, and I think it stands valid point, and I think that there are many researchers who would agree, is that we're getting to a point in our culture where if you don't practice that from the time that you're really small to the time that you're at our age, if you don't practice that on a regular basis, if you don't ask questions about it and survey it, if you get to a point where your communication is online, then it becomes difficult and it transitions from something I can subconsciously know that this person and this person are paying attention, these two aren't, to I have to look someone in the eyes and say, I don't know if Josiah is actually listening to me. Is he listening? Okay, he is. And that fluctuation, while it may not seem to be a threat, poses a problem to us as a culture in that it changes the way that we, when we become professionals in our career, will be able to provide quality communication with our coworkers and with people that we have to provide a service to. And then, of course, the last quote is that social media has created a language group all of its own, and now students struggle with separating their own language group from other language groups. And I think that anyone who's taken cross-cultural communications can understand that there are different communities in each country, there are different cultures in each country, but that it's hard for us to go from one place to another and distinguish that we have a different language group. So, for instance, it's easy for me to leave here and go to Ireland and to tell that I don't fit in when I talk. But it's hard for us often as students to be able to step back and say, okay, I've written this paper for Professor Cruzy, I know he's going to probably grade it easy, it's the end of the semester. Well, these things aren't really professional, they don't really fit a biblical paper, how do I make that work? And so for us as students, the challenge becomes, how do we step back from what we do on a daily basis, 18 hours a day, and find it that we can then step into the role of being a student and communicate in a completely different way that is academic, that is professional. And then there's always the question of, does it really matter? And so my question to you as you leave here today, and my question that I came up with time and time again from professors, and the challenge that I've dealt with in writing this paper is, does it matter? Does it matter to me as a student that I might turn in a paper with 14 ing verbs missing the G at the end of them? Does it matter to me as a student or as an employee of Kuiper or as a future employee of a company that I may not be able to communicate in a healthy way with my employers? And is that an okay thing for our culture to shift into? So I know that I've thrown a lot of facts and statistics, I've thrown a lot of numbers at you and a lot of concepts, but essentially what we've noticed as a trend and what the professors that I spoke with have noticed and what researchers have noticed is that there's a progressive change. And in the case with any new form of technology, when a new form of technology comes on, we as Americans and as humanity have to figure out whether we're going to reject that form of technology or whether we're going to adapt our lifestyles to include that form of technology. And while we think of the iPhone or the iPad or even the cell phone or the laptop, all as forms of communication technology, oftentimes we overlook that social media in and of itself, the programming and the technique, the design and the platform is actually a form of technology. And for us, we have this new form of technology that back in 2003 and 2004 became more and more prevalent. And now here we are 10 years later and we're still trying to figure out, are we going to actually be able to succeed in coping with this? And it's clear that Facebook and social media will not be rejected. With a market share of 41% of people on the internet, and with over 1.2 billion people today using Facebook, and with 90% of people who go on social media platforms using them for more than an hour a day, it's hard for us to try and think that we would ever discard that. But in wrapping this up, it's important for us to realize we need to find a way as both as students and as staff members of a school and as professionals that will be going into a career either next month or in a year or 3 years. It's important for us to realize, how do we enter into a culture in which communication is progressively changing such that we no longer communicate in the base format of telephone and face-to-face communication, but now a predominant amount of communication in the workplace is email and progressively changing to Facebook and Twitter. And do we allow our culture to change from dotting our I's and crossing our T's and using proper punctuation to dropping our G's and abbreviating our words to totes faves and other things such as that, BRB? Is that okay? Is it not okay? Do we lose a quality of communication in that? I would say we do. I leave it up to you to decide if you agree with me or not. Thank you for coming.